आज हम पढ़ने वाले हैं द एंड गेम। और ये वही जेफरी आर्चर की टू कट अ लॉन्ग स्टोरी शॉर्ट की एक कहानी है। वैसे ये कहानी थोड़ी इंटरेस्टिंग है पिछले वालों से। वैसे तो सारी कहानियाँ इंटरेस्टिंग है, लेकिन इसमें इंटरेस्टिंग ये है कि इसमें एक मिलियनेयर है और वो अपनी संपत्ति बांट रहा है। Now there is a twist, as always, like the sting in the tail, which is very particular to the storytelling style of Mr. Jeffrey Archer. लेकिन इसे मैंने पूरा नहीं पढ़ा है, तो आपके साथ ही कंटिन्यू करेंगे। ओके, लेट्स बिगिन। यार इसके नाम ना थोड़े कॉम्प्लेक्स है, इसलिए अगर कहीं कुछ मिस प्रोनाउंसिएशन हो जाए तो माफ़ कर देना। Cornelius Barrington hesitated before he made his next move. He continued to study the board with great interest. The game had been going on for over 2 hours, and Cornelius was confident that he was only 7 moves away from checkmate. He suspected that his opponent was also aware of the fact. Cornelius looked up and smiled across at Frank Winston. Frank Vincent, who was not only his oldest friend but had, over the years, as the family solicitor, proved to be his wisest adviser. The two men had many things in common: their age, both over 60, their background, both middle class sons of professionals. They had been educated at the same school and at the same university. But there the similarities ended. For Cornelius was by nature an entrepreneur, a risk taker, who had made his fortune mining in South Africa and Brazil. Frank was a solicitor by profession, cautious, slow to decision, fascinated by detail. Cornelius and Frank also differed in their physical appearance. Cornelius was tall, heavily built, with a head of silver hair many men half his age would have envied. Frank was slight, of medium stature, and apart from a semicircle of grey tuft, was almost completely bald. Cornelius had been widowed after 4 decades of happy married life. Frank was a confirmed bachelor. Among the things that had kept them close friends was their enduring love for chess. Frank joined Cornelius at the Willows for a game every Thursday evening, and the result usually remained in balance, often ending in stalemate. The evening always began with a light supper, but only one glass of wine each would be poured. The two men took their chess seriously, and after the game was over, they would return to the drawing room to enjoy a glass of brandy and a cigar. But tonight, Cornelius was about to shatter that routine. "Congratulations," said Frank, looking up from the board. "I think you've got me beaten this time. I'm fairly sure there's no escape." He smiled, placed the red king flat on the board, rose from his place, and shook hands with his closest friend. "Let's go through to the drawing room and have a brandy and a cigar," suggested Cornelius, as if it were a novel idea. "Thank you," said Frank as they left the study room and strolled through towards the drawing room. As Cornelius passed the portrait of his son Daniel, his heart missed a beat. Something that hadn't changed for the past 23 years. If his only child had lived, he would have never sold the company. As they entered the spacious drawing room, the two men were greeted by a cheerful fire blazing in the grate, which had been laid by Cornelius' housekeeper, Pauline, only moments after she had finished clearing up their supper. Pauline also believed in the virtues of routine, but her life too was about to be shattered. "I should have trapped you several moves earlier," said Cornelius, But I was taken by surprise when you captured my queen's knight. I sure have seen that coming, he added as he strolled over to the sideboard. Two large cognacs and the two Monte Cristo cigars had been laid out on a silver tray. Cornelius picked up the cigar clipper and passed it across to his friend, then struck a match, leaned over, and watched Frank puff away until he was convinced his cigar was alight. He then completed the same routine himself before sinking into his favorite seat by the fire. Frank raised the glass. "Well played, Cornelius," he said, offering a slight bow, although his host would have been the first to acknowledge that over the years his guest was probably just ahead on points. Cornelius allowed Frank to take a few more puffs before shattering his evening. Why hurry? After all, he had been preparing for this moment for several weeks and was unwilling to share the secret with his oldest friend until everything was in place. They both remained silent for some time, relaxed in each other's company. Finally, Cornelius placed his brandy on a small side table and said, "Frank, we have been friends for over 50 years. Equally importantly, as my legal advisor, you have proved to be a shrewd advocate. In fact, since the untimely death of Millicent, there has been no one I rely on more." Frank continued to puff away at his cigar without interrupting his friend. From the expression of his face, he was aware that the compliment was nothing more than an opening habit. He suspected he would have to wait some time before Cornelius revealed his next move. "When I first set up the company some 30 years ago, it was you who was responsible for executing the original deeds. I don't believe I've signed a legal document since that day which has not crossed your desk. Something that was unquestionably a major factor in my success." "It's generous of you to say so," said Frank, before taking another sip of brandy. "But the truth is that it was always your originality and enterprise that made it possible for the company to go from strength to strength. Gifts that the gods decide not to bestow on me, leaving me with little choice but to be a mere functionary. You've always underestimated your contribution to the company's success, Frank, but I am in no doubt of the role you played over the years." "Where is this all leading?" asked Frank with a smile. "Patience, my friend," said Cornelius. "I still have a few moves to make before I reveal the stratagem I have in mind." He leaned back and took another long puff of his cigar. "As you know, when I sold the company some 4 years ago, it had been my intention to slow down for the first time in years. I had promised to take Mill on an extended holiday to India and the Far East." He paused. "But that was not to be." Frank nodded his head in understanding. "Her death served to remind me that I am also mortal, and may myself not have much time longer to live." "No, no, my friend," protested Frank. "You still have a good many years to go yet." "You may be right," said Cornelius. "Although funnily enough, it was you who made me start to think seriously about the future." "Me?" said Frank, looking puzzled. "Yes, don't you remember some weeks ago sitting in that chair and advising me that the time had come for me to consider rewriting my will?" "Yes, I do," said Frank, "but that was only because In your present, well, virtually everything is left to mill. I am aware of that, said Cornelius, but it nevertheless served to concentrate the mind. You see, I still rise at 6 o'clock every morning, but as I no longer have an office to go, I spend many self indulgent hours considering how to distribute my wealth now that Mel can no longer be the main beneficiary. Cornelius took another long puff of his cigar before continuing. For the past month, I have been considering those around me, my relatives, friends, acquaintances, employees, and I began to think about the way they have always treated me, which caused me to wonder which of them would show the same amount of devotion, attention, and loyalty if I were not worth millions, but a penniless old man. I have a feeling I'm in check, said Frank with a laugh. No, no, my dear friend, said Cornelius. You are absolved from any such doubts. Otherwise, I would not be sharing these confidences with you. But are such thoughts not a little unfair on your immediate family? Not to mention. You may be right, but I don't wish to leave that to chance. I have therefore decided to find out the truth for myself, as I consider mere speculation to be unsatisfactory. Once again, Cornelius paused to take a puff of his cigar before continuing. So indulge me for a moment while I tell you what I have in mind, for I confess that without your cooperation, it will be impossible for me to carry out my little subterfuge. But first, allow me to refill your glass. Cornelius rose from his chair, picked up his friend's empty goblet, and walked to the sideboard. As I was saying, continued Cornelius, passing the refilled glass back to Frank. Frank, I've recently been wondering how those around me would behave if I were penniless. And I have come to the conclusion that there is only one way to find out. Frank took a long gulp before inquiring, what do you have in mind? A fake suicide, perhaps? Not quite as dramatic as that, replied Cornelius, but almost, because he paused again. I intend to declare myself bankrupt. He stared through the haze of smoke, hoping to observe his friend's immediate reaction. But as so often in the past, the old solicitor remained inscrutable, not least because although his friend had just made a bold move, he knew the game was far from over. He pushed upon tentatively forward. How do you intend to go about that? He asked. Tomorrow morning, replied Cornelius. I want you to write to the 5 people who have the greatest claim on my estate. My brother Hugh, his wife Elizabeth, their son Timothy, my sister Margaret, and finally my housekeeper Pauline. And what will be the import of this letter? Asked Frank, trying not to sound too incredulous. You will explain to all of them that due to an unwise investment I made soon after my wife's death, I now find myself in debt. In fact, without their help, I may well be facing bankruptcy. But, protested Frank. Cornelius raised a hand. Hear me out, he pleaded. Because your role in the real life game could prove crucial once you have convinced them that they can no longer expect anything from me, I intend to put the second phase of my plan into operation, which should prove conclusively whether they really care for me or simply for the prospect of my wealth. I can't wait to learn what you have in mind, said Frank. Cornelius swirled the brandy around in his glass while he collected his thoughts. As you are well aware, each of the five people I have named has at some time in the past asked me for a loan. I have never required anything in writing, as I have always considered the repayment of these debts to be a matter of trust. These loans range from £100,000 to my brother Huge to purchase the lease for his shop, which I understand is doing quite well, to my housekeeper Pauline, who borrowed £500 for a deposit on a second-hand car. Even young Timothy needed £1,000 to pay off his university loan. And as he seems to be progressing well in his chosen profession, it should not be too much to ask him, like all of the others, to repay his debt. And the second test? Inquired Frank. Since Mill's death, each of them has performed some little service for me, which they have always insisted they enjoyed carrying about, rather than it being a chore. I am about to find out if they are willing to do the same for a penniless old man. But how will you know? Began Frank. I think that will come. I think that will become obvious as the weeks go by. And in any case, there is a third test, which I believe will settle the matter. Frank stared across at his friend. Is there any point in trying to talk you out of this crazy idea? He asked. No, there is not, replied Cornelius without hesitation. I am all resolved in this matter, although I accept that I cannot make the first move, let alone bring it to a conclusion without your cooperation. If it is truly what you want me to do, Cornelius, then I shall carry out your instruction to the letter, as I have always done in the past. But on this occasion there must be one provision. And what might that be? Asked Cornelius. I shall not charge a fee for this commission, so that I will be able to attest to anyone who should ask that I have not benefited from your shenanigans. But no buts, old friend. I made a handsome profit from my original shareholding when you sold the company. You must consider this a small attempt to say thank you. Cornelius smiled. It is I who should be grateful, and indeed I am, as always, conscious of your valued assistance over the years. You are truly a good friend, and I swear I would leave my entire estate to you if you weren't a bachelor. And if I didn't know it wouldn't change your way of life one iota. No, thank you, said Frank with a chuckle. If you did that, I would only have to carry out exactly the same test with a different set of characters. He paused. So, what is your first move? Cornelius rose from his chair. Tomorrow you will send out 5 letters informing those concerned that a bankruptcy notice has been served on me, and that I require any outstanding loan to be repaid in full, and as quickly as possible. Frank had already begun making notes on a little pad as he always carried with him. 20 minutes later, when he had written down Cornelius' final instructions, he placed the pad back in an inside pocket, drained his glass, and stubbed his cigar. When Cornelius rose to accompany him to the front door, Frank asked, But what is to be the third of your test? The one you're convinced will prove so conclusive? The old solicitor listened carefully as Cornelius outlined an idea of such ingenuity that he departed feeling all the victim would be left with little choice but to reveal their true colors. The first person to call Cornelius on Saturday morning was his brother Hugh. It must have been only moments after he had opened Frank's letter. Cornelius had the distinct feeling that someone else was listening in on the conversation. "I've just received a letter from your solicitor," said Hughes, "and I simply can't take it. Please tell me there's been some dreadful mistake." "I'm afraid there has been no mistake," Cornelius replied. "I only wish I could tell you otherwise." "But how could you, who are normally so shrewd, have allowed such a thing to happen?" "Put it down to old age," replied Cornelius. "A few weeks after Mill's death, I was talked into investing a large sum of money in a company that specialized in supplying mining equipment to the Russians. All of us have read about the endless supply of oil there. If only one could get it. So I was confident my investment would show a handsome return. Last Friday, I was informed by the company secretary that they had filed a 217 order as they were no longer solvent. "But surely you didn't invest everything you had in one company?" said Hughes, sounding even more incredulous. "Not originally, of course," said Cornelius. "But I fear I got sucked in whenever they needed a further injection of cash. Toward the end, I had to go on investing more, as it seemed to me the only way I would have any chance of getting back my original investment." "But doesn't the company have any asset you can lay your hands on? What about all the mining equipment?" "It's all rusting away somewhere in central Russia, and so far we haven't seen a thimbleful of oil." "Why didn't you get out when your losses were still manageable?" asked Hughes. "Pride, I suppose. Unwilling to admit I'd backed a loser. Always believing my money would be safe in the long run." "But they might be offering some recompense," said Hughes desperately. "Not a penny," replied Cornelius. "I can't even afford to fly over and spend a few days in Russia to find out what the true position is." "How much time have they given you?" "A bankruptcy notice has already been served on me, so my very survival depends on how much I can raise in the short term." Cornelius paused. "I'm sorry to remind you of this news, but you will recall that some time ago I loaned you £100,000. So I was rather hoping. But you know that every penny of that money has been sunk into the shop, and with high street sales at an all-time low, I don't think I could lay my hands on more than a few thousand at the moment." Cornelius thought he heard someone whispering the words, "and no more," in the background. "Yes, I can see the predicament you're in," said Cornelius. "But anything you can do to help would be appreciated when you've settled on a sum." He paused again. "And naturally, you'll have to discuss with Elizabeth just how much you can spare. Perhaps you could send a check direct to Frank Vincent's office. He's handling the whole messy business. The lawyers always seem to end up getting their cut, whether you win or lose." "To be fair," said Cornelius, "Frank has waived his fee on this occasion. And while you're on the phone, use the people you're sending the refit, the kitchen, were due to start later this week. It's even more important now that they complete the job as quickly as possible because I'm putting the house on market and a new kitchen will help me get a better price. I'm sure you understand. I'll see what I can do to help, said Yush. But I may have to move that participant theme onto another assignment. We've got a bit of a backlog at the moment. Oh, I thought you said money was a little tight right now, Cornelius said, stifling a little chuckle. It is, said Yush, a little too quickly. What I meant to say was that we're all having to work overtime just to keep our heads above water. I think I understand, said Cornelius. Still, I'm sure you'll be doing everything you can to help. Now you're fully aware of my situation. He put the phone down and smiled. The next victim to contact him didn't bother to phone, but arrived at the front door for a few minutes later. But arrived at the front door a few minutes later and wouldn't take her finger off the buzzer until the door had been opened. Where's Pauline? Was Margaret's first question when her brother opened the door. Cornelius stared down at his sister, who had put on a little too much makeup that morning. Cornelius stared down at his sister, who had put on a little too much makeup that morning. I am afraid she'd had to go, said Cornelius as he bent down to kiss his sister on the cheek. The petitioner in bankruptcy takes a rather dim view of people who can't afford to pay their creditors, but still manage to retain a personal entourage. It was considerate of you to pop around so quickly in my hour of need, Margaret, but if you were hoping for a cup of tea, I'm afraid you'll have to make it yourself. I didn't come around for a cup of tea, as I suspect you know only too well, Cornelius. What I want to know is how you managed to fritter away your entire fortune before her brother could deliver some well rehearsed lines from a script. She added, you will have to sell the house, of course. I've always said that since Mel's death, it's far too large for you. You can always take a bachelor flat in the village. Such decisions are no longer in my hand, said Cornelius, trying to sound helpless. What are you talking about? Demanded Margaret, rounding on him. Just that the house and its content have already been seized by the petitioner in bankruptcy. Are you telling me there's absolutely nothing left? Less than nothing would be more accurate, said Cornelius, sighing. And once they've evicted me from the Willows, I'll have nowhere to go. He tried to sound plaintive. So I was rather hoping that you would allow me to take up the kind offer you made at Mel's funeral and come and live with you. His sister turned away so that Cornelius was unable to see the expression on her face. That wouldn't be convenient at the present time, she said without explanation. And in any case, you and Elizabeth have far more spare rooms in their house than I do. Quite so, said Cornelius. He coughed. And the small loan I advanced you last year, Margaret. I'm sorry to raise the subject, but what little money I have is carefully invested, and my broker tell me that this is not a time to sell. But the allowance I've provided every month for past 20 years, surely you have a little salted away. I am afraid not, Margaret replied. You must understand that being your sister has meant I am expected to maintain a certain standard of living. And now that I can no longer rely on my monthly allowance, I shall have to be even more careful with my meager income. Of course you will, my dear, said Cornelius, but any little contribution would help if you felt able. I must be off, said Margaret, looking at her watch. You've already made me late for the hairdresser. Just one more little request before you go, my dear, said Cornelius. In the past, you've always been kind enough to give me a lift into town whenever. I've always said, Cornelius, that you should have learned to ago. Drive years ago. If you had, you wouldn't expect everyone to be at your beck and call night and day. I'll see what I can do. She added as he opened the door for her. Funny, I don't recall you ever saying that. But then perhaps my memory is going as well. He said as he followed his sister out onto the drive. He smiled. New car, Margaret? He inquired instantly. Yes, his sister replied tartly as he opened the door for her. Cornelius thought he detected a slight coloring in her cheeks. He chuckled to himself as she drove off. He was learning more about his family by the minute. Cornelius strolled back into the house and returned to his study. He closed the door, picked up the phone on his desk, and dialed Frank's office. Vincent, Elwood, and Hawthorne, said a prim voice. I'd like to speak to Mr. Vincent. Vincent, Elwood, and Hawthorne, said a prim voice. I'd like to speak to Mr. Vincent. Who shall I say is calling? Cornelius Barrington. I'll have to see if he's free, Mr. Barrington. Very good, thought Cornelius. Frank must have convinced even his receptionist that the rumors were true, because in the past her response had always been, I'll put you straight through, sir. Good morning, Cornelius, said Frank. I've just put the phone down on your brother Hughes. That's the second time he's called this morning. What did he want? Asked Cornelius. To have the full implication explained to him and also immediate obligations. Good, said Cornelius. So can I hope to receive a check for $1,000 in the near future? I doubt it, said Frank. From the tone of his voice, I don't think that's what he was having in mind. But I'll let you know just as soon as I've heard back from him. I shall look forward to that, Frank. I do believe you're enjoying yourself, Cornelius. You bet I am, he replied. I only wish Mel was here to share the fun with me. You know what she would have said, don't you? No, but I have a feeling you're about to tell me. You're a wicked old man. Ah, yes, always. She had been right. Cornelius confessed with a laugh. Goodbye, Frank. As he replaced the receiver, there was a knock at the door. Come in, said Cornelius, puzzled as to who it could possibly be. The door opened and his housekeeper entered, carrying a tray with a cup of tea and a plate of shortbread biscuit. She was, as always, neat and trim, not a hair out of place, and showed no sign of embarrassment. She can't have received Frank's letters. She can't have received Frank's letter yet, as Cornelius first thought. Pauline, he said as she placed the tray on his desk, did you receive a letter from my solicitor this morning? Yes, I did, sir, Pauline replied. And of course I shall sell the car immediately and repay your 5,500 pound. She paused before looking straight at him. But I was just wondering, sir. Yes, Pauline. Would it be possible for me to work it off in lieu? You see, I need a car to pick up my girls from school. For the first time since he had embarked on the enterprise, Cornelius felt guilty. But he knew that if he agreed to Pauline's request, someone would find out and the whole enterprise would be endangered. I'm so sorry, Pauline, but I'll have been left with no choice. But I have been left with no choice. That's exactly what the solicitor explained in his letter, Pauline said, fiddling with a piece of paper in the pocket of her pinafore. Pinafore. Mind you, I never did go much on lawyers. This statement made Cornelius feel even more guilty because he didn't know a more trustworthy person than Frank Vincent. I'd better leave you now, sir, but I'll pop back this evening just to make sure things don't get too untidy. Would it be possible, sir? Possible? Said Cornelius. Could you give me a reference? I mean, you see, it's not that easy for someone to my of my age to find a job. I mean, you see, it's not that easy for someone of my age to find a job. I'll give you a reference that would get you a position in Buckingham Palace, said Cornelius. He immediately sat down at his desk and wrote a glowing homily, glowing homily on the service Pauline Croft had been given for over 2 decades. He read it through, then handed it across to her. Thank you, Pauline, he said, for all you have done in the past for Daniel, Mill, and most of all myself. My pleasure, sir, said Pauline. Once she had closed the door behind her, Cornelius could only wonder if water wasn't something thicker than blood. He sat back down at his desk and began writing some notes to remind him what had taken that morning. When he had finished, he went through to the kitchen to make himself some lunch and found a salad had been laid out for him. After lunch, Cornelius took a bus into the town, a noble experience. It was some time before he located a bus stop, and then he discovered that the conductor didn't have change for a 20-pound note. His first call after he had been dropped off in the town centre was to the local estate agent, who didn't seem that surprised to see him. Cornelius was delighted to find how quickly the rumor of his financial demise must be spreading. I'll have someone call around to the Willows in the morning, Mr. Barrington, said the young man rising from behind his desk, so we can measure up and take some photographs. May we also have your permission to place a sign in the garden? Please do, said Cornelius without hesitation, and barely stopped himself from adding, the bigger the better. After he'd left the estate agent, Cornelius walked a few yards down the street and called into the local removal firm. He asked another young man if he could make an appointment for them to take away the entire contents of the house. Where's it all to go, sir? To Bot's storeroom in the High Street, Cornelius informed him. To Bot's storeroom in the High Street, Cornelius informed him. That will be no problem, sir, said the young assistant, picking up a pad from his desk. Once Cornelius had completed the forms in triplicate, the assistant said, "Sign there, sir," pointing to the bottom of the form, then looked a little nervous. He added, "We'll need a deposit of £100. "Of course," said Cornelius, taking out his checkbook. "I'm afraid it will have to be cash, sir," the young man said in a confidential tone. Cornelius smiled. No one had refused a check from him for over 30 years. "I'll call back tomorrow," he said. On the way back to the bus stop, Cornelius stared through the window of his brother's hardware store and noted that the staff didn't seem all that busy. On arriving back at the Willows, he returned to his study and made some more notes on what had taken place that afternoon. As he climbed the stairs to go to the bed that night, he reflected that it must have been that first afternoon in years that no one had called him to ask how he was. He slept soundly that night. When Cornelius came downstairs, the fellow mon- when Cornelius came downstairs the following morning, he picked up his post from the mat and made his way to the kitchen. Over a over a bowl of cornflakes, he checked through the letters. He had once been told that if it was known you were likely to go bankrupt, a stream of brown envelopes would begin to drop through the letterbox, as shopkeepers and small businessmen tried to get in before anyone else could be declared a preferred creditor. There were no brown envelopes in the post that morning because Cornelius had made certain every bill had been covered before he began his journey down the particular road. Other than circulars and free offers, there was just one white envelope with a London postmark. It turned out to be a handwritten letter from his nephew Timothy, saying how sorry he was to learn of his uncle's problem, and that although he didn't get back to Shirley much nowadays, he would make every effort to travel up to Shropshire at the weekend and call in to see him. Although the message was brief, Cornelius silently noted that Timothy was the first member of the family to show any sympathy for his predicament. When he heard the doorbell ring, he placed the letter to the kitchen table and walked out into the hall. He opened the front door to be greeted by Elizabeth, his brother's wife. Her face was white, lined, and drained, and Cornelius doubted if she had slept a great deal the previous night. The moment Elizabeth had stepped into the house, she began to pace around the room. She began to pace around from room to room, almost as though she was checking to see that everything was still in place, as if she couldn't accept the words she had read in the solicitor's letter. Any lingering doubts must have been dispelled when a few minutes later the local estate agent appeared on the doorstep, tape measure in hand, with a photographer by his side. If Hughes was able to return even part of the 100,000 I loaned him, that would be most helpful, Cornelius remarked to his sister-in-law as he followed her through the house. It was some time before she spoke, despite the fact that she had had all night to consider her response. "It's not quite that easy," she eventually replied. "You see, the loan was made to the company, and the shares are distributed among several people." Cornelius knew all three of the several people. then perhaps the time has come for you and you to sell off some of your shares and allow some strangers to take over the company. After all the work we've put in over the years. No, we can't afford to let that happen. In any case, you asked Mr. Vincent what the legal position was, and he confirmed that there was no obligation on our part to sell any of our shares. Have you considered that perhaps you have a moral obligation? Asked Cornelius, turning to his sister in law. Cornelius. Cornelius, she said, avoiding his stare. It has been your irresponsibility, not ours, that has been the cause of your downfall. Surely you wouldn't expect your brother to sacrifice everything he's worked for over the years, simply to place my family in the same perilous position in which you now find yourself. Cornelius realized why Elizabeth hadn't slept the Cornelius realized why Elizabeth hadn't slept the previous night. She was not only acting as spokeswoman for Hughes, but was obviously making the decisions as well. Cornelius had always considered her to be the stronger willed of the two, and he doubted if he would come face to face with his brother before an agreement had been reached. But if there's any other way we might help, Elizabeth added in a more gentle tone, as her hand rested on an ornate gold leaf table in the drawing room. Well, now you mention it, replied Cornelius. I'm putting the house on the market in a couple of weeks' time and will be looking for. That soon? Said Elizabeth. And what's going to happen to all the furniture? It will all have to be sold to help cover the debts. But as I said, you has always liked the table. Louis XIV, said Cornelius casually. I wonder what it's worth, Elizabeth mused, trying to make it sound as if it were a little consequence. I have no idea, said Cornelius. If I remember correctly, I paid around £60,000 for it, but that was over 10 years ago. And the chess set? Elizabeth asked, picking up one of the pieces. It's a worthless copy. It's a worthless copy, Cornelius replied. You could pick up a set just like this in any Arab bazaar for a couple of £100. Oh, I always thought. Elizabeth hesitated before replacing the piece on the wrong square. Well, I must be off, she said, sounding as if her task had been completed. We must try not to forget that I still have a business to run. Cornelius accompanied her as she began striding back down the long corridor in the direction of the front door. She walked straight by the portrait of her nephew Daniel. In the past, she had always stopped to remark on how much she missed him. I was wondering, began Cornelius, as they walked out into the hall. Yes, said Elizabeth. Well, as I have to be out of here in a couple of weeks, I hoped it might be possible to move in with you. That's it. Until I find somewhere I can afford. If only you'd asked a week ago. If only if you'd asked a week ago, said Elizabeth. Without missing a beat. But unfortunately, we've just agreed to take in my mother, and the only other room in Timothy's is Timothy's, and he comes home most weekends. Is that so? Said Cornelius. And the grandfather clock? Asked Elizabeth, who still appeared to be on a shopping expedition. Victorian purchased from Earl of Bute's estate. No, I meant how much is it worth? Whatever someone is willing to pay for it, Cornelius replied as they reached the front door. Don't forget to let me know, Cornelius, if there's anything I can do to help. How kind of you, Elizabeth, he said, opening the door to find the estate agent hammering a stake into the ground with a sign on it declaring for sale. Cornelia smiled, because it was the only thing that morning that had stopped Elizabeth in her tracks. Frank Vincent arrived on the Thursday evening, carrying a bottle of cognac and two pizzas. If I'd realized that losing Pauline would be part of the deal, I would never have agreed to go along with your plan in the first place, Frank said as he nibbled at his microwaved pizza. How do you manage without her? Rather badly, Cornelius admitted, although she still drops in for an hour or two every evening. Otherwise, this place would look like a pigsty. Come to think of it, how do you cope? As a bachelor, Frank replied, you learn the art of survival from an early age. As a bachelor, Frank replied, you learn the art of survival from an early age. And now let's stop this small talk and get on with the game. Which game? Inquired Cornelius with a chuckle. Chess, replied Frank. I've, I've had enough of the other game for 1 week. Then we'd better go through to the library. Frank was surprised by Cornelius' opening moves, as he had never known his old friend to be so daring. Neither of them spoke again for over an hour, most of which Frank spent trying to defend his queen. This might well be the last game we play with this set, said Cornelius wistfully. No, don't worry yourself about that, said Frank. They always allow you to keep a few personal items. Not when you're worth £250,000, replied Cornelius. I had no idea, Frank. I had no idea, said Frank, looking up, because you're not the sort of man who has ever been interested in worldly goods. It's a 16th century Persian masterpiece, and it's bound to cause considerable interest when it comes under the hammer. But surely you've found out all you need to know by now, said Frank. Why carry on with the exercise when you could lose so much that's dear to you? Because I still have to discover the truth. Frank sighed, stared down at the board, and moved his queen's knight. Checkmate, he said. It serves you right for not concentrating. Cornelius spent most of Friday morning in a private meeting with the managing director of Botts and Company, the local fine art and furniture auctioneer. Mr. Botts had already agreed that the sale could take place in a fortnight's time. He had often repeated that he would have preferred a longer period to prepare the catalogue and send out an extensive mailing for such a fine collection, but at least He showed some sympathy for the position Mr. Barrington found himself in. Over the years, Lloyd's of London, death, duties, and impending bankruptcy had proved the auctioneer's best friends. We will need to have everything in our storeroom as soon as possible, said Mr. Botts. So there's enough time to prepare a catalog, while still allowing the customers to view on 3 consecutive days before the sale took place. Cornelius nodded his agreement. The auctioneer also recommended that a full page be taken in the Shortly Advertiser that following Wednesday, giving details of what was coming under the hammer, so they could reach those people they failed to contact by post. Cornelius felt Mr. Botts a few minutes Cornelius left Mr. Botts a few minutes before midday. On his way back to the bus stop, dropped into the removal company. He handed over £100 in 5 cents, leaving the impression that it had taken him a few days to raise the cash. While waiting for the bus, he couldn't help noticing how few people bothered to say good morning or even acknowledge him. Certainly, no one crossed the road to pass the time of day. 20 men in 3 vans spent the next days loading and unloading as they traveled back and forth between the Willows and the auctioneer's storeroom in High Street. It was not until the early morning that the last stick of furniture had been removed from the house. As he walked through the empty rooms, Cornelius was surprised to find himself thinking that, with 1 or 2 exceptions, he wasn't going to miss many of his worldly possessions. He retired to the bedroom, and the only room in the house that was still furnished, and continued to read the novel Elizabeth had recommended before his downfall. The following morning, he only had one call from his nephew Timothy to say he was up for the weekend and wondered if Uncle Cornelius could find time to see him. Time is the one thing I still have plenty of, replied Cornelius. Then why don't I drop around this afternoon? Said Timothy. Shall we say 4 o'clock? I'm sorry I can't offer you a cup of tea, said Cornelius, but I finished the last packet this morning, and as I'm probably leaving the house next week. It's not important, said Timothy, who was unable to mask his distress as at finding the house stripped of his uncle's possession. Let's go up to the bedroom. It's the only room that still has any furniture in it, and most of that will be gone by next week. I had no idea they'd taken everything away, even the pictures of Daniel. Timothy said as he passed on. Timothy said as he passed an oblong patch of a lighter shade of green than the rest of the wall. And my chest set, said Cornelius. But I can't complain. I've had a good life. He began to climb the stairs to the bedroom. Cornelius sat in the only chair while Timothy perched on the end of the bed. And the old man studied his nephew more closely. He had grown into a fine young man, an open face with clear brown eyes that served to reveal to anyone who didn't already know that he had been adopted. He must have been 27 or 28, about the same age Daniel would have been if he was still alive. Cornelius had always had a soft spot for his nephew, and had imagined that his affection was reciprocated. He wondered if he was about to disillusionize. He wondered if he was about to be disillusioned once again. Timothy appeared nervous, shuffling uneasily from foot to foot as he perched on the end of the bed. Uncle Cornelius, he began. His head slightly bowed. As you know, I have received a letter from Mr. Vincent, so I thought I ought to come to see you and explain that I simply don't have 1,000 pound to my name, and therefore I am unable to repay my debt at present. Cornelius was disappointed. He had hoped that just one of the family. However, the young man continued, removing a long thin envelope from the inside pocket of his jacket. On my 21st birthday, my father presented me with shares of 1% of the company, which I think must be worth at least 1,000 pounds. So I wonder if you would consider taking them in exchange for my debt. That is, until I can afford to buy them back. Cornelius felt guilty for having doubted his nephew even for a moment. He wanted to apologize, but he knew he couldn't. If the house of cards was to remain in place for a few more days, he took the widow's mite and thanked Timothy. I am aware just how much of a sacrifice this must be for you, said Cornelius, remembering how many times you have told me in the past of your ambition to take over the company when your father eventually retires, and your dreams of expanding into areas he was refused, into areas he has refused even to contemplate. I don't think he'll ever retire, said Timothy with a sigh. But I was hoping that ever after all the experience I've gained working in London, he might take me seriously as a candidate for manager when Mr. Leonard retires at the end of the year. I fear your chances wouldn't be advanced when he learns that you handed over 1% of the company to your bankrupt uncle. My problems can hardly be compared with ones you are facing. I'm only sorry I can't hand over the cash right now. Before I leave, is there anything I can do for you? Yes, there is, Timothy, said Cornelius, returning to the script. Your mother recommended a novel which I've been enjoying, but my old eyes seem to tire earlier and earlier. And I wonder if you'd be kind enough to read a few pages to me. I've marked the place I've reached. I marked the place I've reached. I can remember you reading to me when I was a child, said Timothy. Just William and swallows and Amazons, he added as he took the proffered book. Timothy must have read about 20 pages when he suddenly stopped and looked up. There's a bus ticket at page 450. Shall I leave it there, uncle? Yes, please do, said Cornelius. I put it there to remind me of something. He paused. Forgive me, but I'm feeling a little tired. Timothy rose and said, I'll come back soon and finish up the last few pages. No need to bother yourself. I'll be able to manage that. Oh, I think I'd better, uncle. Otherwise, I'll never find out which one of them becomes Prime Minister. The second batch of letters, which Frank Vincent sent out on the following Friday, caused another flurry of phone calls. I'm not sure I fully understand what it means, said Margaret in her first communication with her brother since calling around to see him a fortnight before. It means exactly that it says, my dear, said Cornelius calmly. All my words, all my worldly goods are to come under the hammer. But I am allowing those I consider near and dear to me to select one item that, for sentimental or personal reasons, they would like to see remain in the family. They will then be able to bid for them at the auction next Friday. But we could all be outbid and end up with nothing, said Margaret. Oh no, my dear, said Cornelius, trying not to sound exasperated. The public auction will be held in the afternoon. The selected pieces will be auctioned separately in the morning with only the family and close friends present. The instructions couldn't be clearer. The instructions couldn't be clearer. And are we able to see the pieces before the auction takes place? Yes, Margaret, said her brother, as if addressing a backward child. As Mr. Vincent stated clearly in his letter, viewing Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. before the sale on Friday at 11 o'clock. But we can only select one piece. Yes, repeated Cornelius, that is all the petitioner in bankruptcy would allow. But you will be pleased to know that the portrait of Daniel, which you have commented on so many times in the past, will be among the lots available for your consideration. Yes, I do like it, said Margaret. She hesitated for a moment. But will the Turner also be up for sale? It certainly will, said Cornelius. I'm being forced to sell everything. Have you any idea what Hughes and Elizabeth are after? No, I haven't, but if you want to find out, why don't you ask them? He replied mischievously, aware that they scarcely exchange a word from one year's end to the next. Aware that they scarcely exchange a word from one year's end to the next. The second call came only moments after he had put the phone down on his sister. At last, said at last, said a peremptory voice, as if it was somehow Cornelius' fault that others might also wish to speak to him. Good morning, Elizabeth, said Cornelius, immediately recognizing the voice. How nice to hear from you. It's about the letter I received this morning. Yes, I thought it might be, said Cornelius. It's just, well, I wanted to confirm the value of the table. So the Louis 14 piece, and while I'm on the line, the grandfather clock that used to belong to the Earl of Bute. If you go to the auction house, Elizabeth, they will give you a catalog which tells you the high and low estimate for each item in the sale. I see, said Elizabeth. She remained silent for some time. I don't suppose you know if you. I don't suppose you know if Margaret will be bidding for either of those pieces. I have no idea, replied Cornelius. But it was Margaret, who was blocking the line when you were trying to get through, and she asked me a similar question. So I suggest you give her a call. Another long silence. By the way, Elizabeth, you do realize that you can only bid for one item. Yes, it says as much in the letter. Yes, it says as much in the letter, replied his sister-in-law tartly. I only asked because I always thought you was interested in the chess set. Oh no, I don't think so, said Elizabeth. Cornelius wasn't in any doubt who would be doing the bidding on behalf of that family on Friday morning. Well, good luck, said Cornelius, and don't forget the 15% commission, he added as he put down the phone. Timothy wrote the following day to say he was hoping to end the auction, as he wanted to pick up a little memento of the Willows and his uncle and aunt. Pauline, however, told Cornelius as she tidied up the bathroom. Pauline, however, told Cornelius. Pauline, however, told Cornelius as she tidied up the bedroom that she had no intention of going to the auction. Why not? He asked. Because I'd be sure to make a fool of myself and bid for something I couldn't afford. Very wise, said Cornelius. I've fallen into the trap once or twice myself. But did you have your eyes on anything in particular? Yes, I did. But my savings would never stretch to it. Oh, you can never be sure with auctions, said Cornelius. If no one else joins in the bid, sometimes you can make a killing. Well, I'll think about it now I've got a new job. I'm so pleased to hear that, said Cornelius, who was genuinely disappointed to learn her news. Neither Cornelius nor Frank was able to concentrate on their weekly chess match that Thursday evening, and after half an hour they abandoned the game and settled on a draw. I must confess that I can't wait for this thing to return to normal, said Frank, as his host poured him a glass of cooking sherry. Cooking sherry. Oh, I don't know. I find the situation has its compensations. Like what, for example? Said Frank, who frowned after his first sip. Well, for a start, I'm looking forward to tomorrow's auctions. But what could still go badly wrong? Said Frank. What can possibly go wrong? Asked Cornelius. Well, for a start, have you considered? But he didn't bother to complete the sentence because his friend wasn't listening. Cornelius was the first to arrive at the auction the following morning. The room was laid out with 120 chairs in neat rows of 12 ready for the anticipated packed house that afternoon. But Cornelius thought the real drama would unfold in the morning when only 6 people would be in attendance. The next person to appear 15 minutes before the auction was due to begin was Cornelius' solicitor Frank Vincent, observing his client deep in conversation with Mr. Botts, who would be conducting the auction. He took a seat towards the back of the room on the right hand side. Cornelius' sister Margaret was the next to make an appearance, and she was not as considerate. She charged straight up to Mr. Botts and asked in a shrill voice, Can I sit anywhere I like? Yes, madam, you most certainly can. Yes, madam, you most certainly can. Yes, madam, you most certainly can, said Mr. Botts. Margaret immediately commandeered the center seat in the front row, directly below the auctioneer's podium. Cornelius gave his sister a nod before walking down the aisle and taking a chair 3 rows in front of Frank. Hughes and Elizabeth were the next to arrive. They stood at the ba- they stood at the back for some time while they considered the layout of the room. Eventually, they strolled up the aisle and occupied 2 seats in the eighth row, which afforded them a perfect sight line to the podium, while at the same time being able to keep an eye on Margaret. Opening move to Elizabeth, thought Cornelius, who was quietly enjoying himself. As the hour hand of the clock on the wall behind the auctioneer's rostrum ticked ticked inexorably toward 11, Cornelius was disappointed that neither Pauline nor Timothy made an appearance. Just as the auctioneer began to climb the steps to the podium, the door at the back of the room eased open, and Pauline's head peered around. The rest of her body remained hidden behind the door until her eyes settled on Cornelius, who smiled encouragingly. She stepped into and closed the door, but showed no interest in taking a seat, retreating into a corner instead. The auctioneer beamed down at the hand-picked invitees as the clock struck 11. Ladies and gentlemen, we begin. Ladies and gentlemen, he began. I've been in this business for over 30 years, but this is the first time I've conducted a private sale. So this is a most unusual auction, even for me. I'd better go over the ground rules so that no one can be in any doubt. Or should a dispute arise later? As all of you present have some special association with her as family or friends with Mr. Cornelius Barrington, whose personal effects are coming under the hammer. Each of you have been invited to select one item from the inventory for which you will be allowed to bid. You should be successful, you may not bid for any other lot. Should you be successful, you may not bid for any other lot. But if you fail on the item of your first choice, you may join in the bidding for any other lots. I hope that is clear, he said. He said as the door was flung open and Timothy rushed in. So sorry, so sorry, he said a little breathlessly, but my train was held up. He quickly took a seat in the back row. Cornelius smiled. Every one of his pawns was now in place. As there are only 5 of you eligible to bid, continued Mr. Botts, as if there had been no interruption, only 5 items will come under the hammer. By the law states that if anyone has previously left a written bid, the bid must be recognized as part of the auction. I shall make things as easy to follow as possible by saying if I have a bid at the table from which you should assume it is a bid left at our office by a member of the public. I think it would be only fair to point out, he added, that I have outside bids on 4 of the 5 items. Having examined the ground rules, Having examined the ground rules, I will, with your permission, begin the auction. He glanced towards the back of the room at Cornelius, who nodded his assent. The first lot I am able to offer is a long case clock dated 1892, which was purchased by Mr. Barrington from the estate of the late Earl Bluth. Which was purchased by Mr. Barrington from the estate of the late Earl of Bute. I shall open the bidding for this lot at £3,000. Do I see 3,000? Do I see £3,500? Mr. Botts raised. Mr. Botts asked, raising an eyebrow. Elizabeth looked a little shocked as 3,000 was just below the low estimate and the figure she and you had agreed on this morning. Is anyone interested in the slot? Asked Mr. Botts, looking directly at Elizabeth. But she remained apparently mesmerized. I shall ask once again if anyone wished to bid 3,500 for this magnificent long case clock. For this magnificent long case clock. Fair warning. I see no bids, so I shall have to withdraw this item and place it in the afternoon sale. Elizabeth still seemed to be in a state of shock. She immediately turned to her husband and began in a whispered conversation with him. Mr. Botts looked a little disappointed, but moved quickly on to a second lot. The next lot is a charming watercolor of the Thames by William Turner of Oxford. Can I open the bidding at £2,000? Margaret waved her catalogue furiously. Thank you, madam, said the auctioneer, beaming down at her. I have an outside bid of £3,000. Will anyone offer me £4,000? Yes, shouted Margaret, as if the room was so crowded that she needed to make herself heard above the din. I have a bid of 5,000 at the table. Will you bid 6, madam? I have a bid of 5,000 at the table. Will you bid 6, madam? He asked, returning his attention to the lady in the front row. I will, said Margaret, equally firmly. Are there any other bids? Demanded the auctioneer, glancing around the room, a sure sign that the bids at the table had dried up. Then I'm going to let this picture go for 6,000 to the lady in front row. 7, said a voice behind her. Margaret looked around to see that her sister-in-law had joined in the bidding. 8,000, shouted Margaret. 9, said Elizabeth without hesitation. 10,000, bellowed Margaret. Suddenly there was silence. Cornelius glanced across the room to see a smile of satisfaction across Elizabeth's face. Having left her sister-in-law with a bill for £10,000, Cornelius wanted to burst out laughing. The auction was turning out to be even more entertaining than he could have hoped. There being no more bids, this delightful watercolor is sold to Miss Barrington for £10,000, said Mr. Botts, as he brought the hammer down with a thump. He smiled down at Margaret as if she had made a wise investment. The next lot, he continued, is a portrait simply entitled Daniel by an unknown artist. It is a well executed work, and I was hoping to open the bidding at £100. Do I see a bid of 100? To Cornelius' disappointment, no one in the room seemed to be showing any interest in the lot. I'm willing to consider a bid of £50 to get things started, said Mr. Botts. But I am but I am unable to go any lower. Will anyone bid me £50? Cornelius glanced around the room, trying to work out from the expressions on their faces who had selected this item, and why they no longer wished to bid when the price was so reasonable. Then I fear I will have to withdraw this lot as well. Does that mean I've got it? Asked a voice from the back. Everyone looked around. If you are willing to bid £50, madam, said Mr. Botts, adjusting his spectacles. The picture is yours. Yes, please, said Pauline. Yes, please, said Pauline. Mr. Botts smiled in her direction as he brought down the hammer. Sold to the lady at the back of the room, he declared, for £50. Now I move on to lot number 4. A chest set to Now I move on to a lot number 4. A chess set of unknown provenance. What shall I say for this item? Can I start someone off with £100? Thank you, sir. Cornelius looked around to see who was bidding. I have 200 at the table. Can I say 300? Timothy nodded. I have a bid at the table for 350. Can I say 400? This time Timothy looked crestfallen, and Cornelius assumed the sum was beyond his limit. Then I am going to have to withdraw this piece also and place it in afternoon's sale. The auctioneer stared at Timothy. The auctioneer stared at Timothy, but he didn't even blink. The item is withdrawn. The item is withdrawn. And finally I turned to lot number 5. A magnificent Louis XIV table, Sierra 1712, in almost mint condition. Its provenance can be traced back to its original owner, and it has been in the possession of Mr. Barrington for the past 11 years. The full details are in your catalogue. I must warn you that there have been a lot of interest in this item, and I shall open the bidding at £50,000. Elizabeth immediately raised her catalogue above her head. Thank you, madam. Thank you, madam. I have a bid at the table of £60,000. Do I see 70? He asked, his eyes fixed on Elizabeth. Her catalogue shot up again. Thank you, madam. I have a bid at the table of 80,000. Do I see 90? This time Elizabeth seemed to hesitate before raising her catalogue slowly. I have a bid at the table for 100,000. Do I see 110? Everyone in the room was now looking to her. Everyone in the room was now looking toward Elizabeth, except you, who, head down, was staring at the floor. He obviously wasn't going to have any influence on the bidding. If there are no further bids, I shall have to withdraw this lot and place it in afternoon sale. Fair warning, declared Mr. Botts. As he raised his hammer, Elizabeth's catalogue suddenly shot up. 110,000. Thank you, madam. Are there any more bids? Then I shall let fine piece of this Then I shall let this fine piece for 110,000. Then I shall let this fine piece go for 110,000 pounds. 110,000 pounds. He brought down his hammer and smiled at Elizabeth. Congratulations, congratulations, madam. It is indeed a magnificent example of the period. She smiled weakly back, a look of uncertainty on her face. She smiled weakly back, a look of uncertainty on her face. Cornelius turned around and winked at Frank, who remained impassively in his seat. He then rose from his place and made his way to the podium to thank Mr. Botts for a job well done. As he turned to leave, he smiled at Margaret and Elizabeth, but neither acknowledged him, as they both seemed to be preoccupied. Hugh, head in hands, continued to stare at Hugh, head in hands, continued to stare. Hugh's head in hands continued to stare down at the floor. As Cornelius walked towards the back of the hall, he could see no sign of Timothy, and assumed that his nephew must have had to return to London. Cornelius was disappointed, as he had hoped that the lad might join him for a pub lunch. After such a successful morning, he felt a little celebrating was in order. He had already decided that he wasn't going to attend the afternoon sale, as he had no desire to witness his worldly goods coming under the hammer, even though he wouldn't have room for most of them once he moved into a smaller house. But Mr. Botts had promised to call him the moment the sale was over and report how much the auction had raised. Having enjoyed the best meal since Pauline had left him, Cornelius began his journey back from the pub to the Willows. He knew exactly what time the bus would appear to take him home, and arrived at the bus stop with a couple of minutes to spare. He now took it for granted that people would avoid his company. Cornelius unlocked the front door as the clock on nearby church struck 3. He was looking forward to the inevitable fallout when it sank into Margaret and Elizabeth how much they had really bid. He grinned as he headed towards his study and glanced at his watch, wondering when he might expect a call from Mr. Botts. The phone began to ring just as he entered the room. He chuckled to himself. It was too early for Mr. Botts, so it had to be Elizabeth or Margaret who had needed to see him urgently. He picked up the phone to hear Frank's voice on the other end of the line. "Did you remember to withdraw the chess set from the afternoon sale?" Frank asked, without bothering with any formalities. "What are you talking about?" said Cornelius. "Your beloved chess set. Have you forgotten that as it failed to sell this morning, it will automatically come up in the afternoon sale? Unless, of course, you've already given orders to withdraw it, or tripped off Mr. Botts about its true value." "Oh my God," said Cornelius. He dropped the phone and ran back out of the door. So he didn't hear Frank say, "I'm sure a telephone call to Mr. Botts' assistant is all that will be needed." "I'm sure a telephone call to Mr. Botts' assistant is all that will be needed." Cornelius checked his watch as he ran down the path. It was 3:10, so the auction would have only just begun. Running towards the bus stop, he tried to recall what lot number the chess set was. All he could remember was that there were 153 lots in sale. Standing at the bus stop, hoping impatiently from foot to foot, he scanned the road in hope of hailing a passing taxi. When to his relief, he saw a bus heading towards him. Although his eyes never left the driver, that didn't make him go any faster. Although his eyes never left the driver, that didn't make him go any faster. When it eventually drew up beside him and the doors opened, Cornelius leaped on and took his place on the front seat. He wanted to tell the driver to take him straight to Botts and Company in the High Street, and to hell the fare. But he doubted if the other passengers would have fallen in with his plan. He stared at his watch, 3:17 p.m., and tried to remember how long it had taken Mr. Botts that morning to dispose a lot and tried to remember how long it had taken Mr. Botts that morning to dispose of each lot. About a minute and a half perhaps, he concluded. The bus came to a halt at every stop on its short journey into town. Cornelius spent as much time following the progress of the minute hand as his watch as he did the journey. The driver finally reached the high street at 3:31 p.m. Even the door seemed to open slowly. Cornelius leapt out onto the pavement and, despite not having run for years, sprinted for the second time that day. He covered the 200 yards to the auction house in less than record pace, but still arrived exhausted. He charged into the auction room as Mr. Botts declared Lot 32 a long clock originally purchased from the estate of. Cornelius' eyes swept the room, coming to rest on an auctioneer's clerk who was standing in the corner with her catalog open. Entering the hammer price after each lot had been sold. He walked over to her just as a woman he thought he recognized slipped quickly past him and out of the door. He walked over to her just as a woman he thought he recognized slipped quickly past him and out of the door. Has the chess set come up yet? Asked a still out of breath Cornelius. Let me check, sir, the clerk replied, flicking back through her catalogue. Yes, here it is, Lot 27. How much did it fetch? Asked Cornelius. 450 pounds, sir, she replied. Mr. Botts called Cornelius later that evening to inform that the afternoon sale had raised 900 2,000 and 902,800 pounds. For more than he had estimated. Do you by any chance know who bought the chess set? Was Cornelius' only question. No, replied Mr. Botts. All I can tell you is that it was purchased on behalf of a client. The buyer paid in cash and took the item away. As he climbed the stair to go to bed, Cornelius had to admit that everything had gone to plan except for disastrous loss of the chess set, for which he realized he had only himself to blame. For which he realized he had only himself to blame. What made it worse was that he knew Frank would never refer to the indecent again. What made it worse was that he knew Frank would never refer to the incident again. Cornelius was in the bathroom when the phone rang at 7:30 the following morning. Obviously, someone had been lying awake, wondering what was the earliest moment they could possibly. Obviously, someone had been lying awake, wondering what was the earliest moment they could possibly disturb him. They could possibly disturb him. Is that you, Cornelius? Yes, he replied, yawning noisily. Who's this? He added, knowing only too well. It's Elizabeth. I'm sorry to call you so early, but I need to see you urgently. Of course, my dear, Cornelius replied. Why don't you join me for tea this afternoon? Oh no, it can't wait until then. I have to see you this morning. Could I come around at 9? I'm sorry, Elizabeth, but I already have an appointment at 9. He paused. But I could fit you in at 10 for half an hour. Then I wouldn't. Then I won't be late for my meeting with Mr. Botts at 11. Could I give you a lift into town if that would help? Suggested Elizabeth. That's extremely kind of you, my dear, said Cornelius, but I've got used to taking the bus, and in any case, I wouldn't want to impose on you. Forward to see you. Look forward to seeing you at 10. Then he put down the phone. Then he put the phone down. Cornelius was still in the bath when the phone rang a second time. He wallowed in he, he wallowed in the warm water until the ringing had ceased. He knew it was Margaret, and he was sure she would call back within minutes. He hadn't finished drying himself before the phone rang again. He walked slowly to the bedroom, picked up the receiver by his bed, and said, Good morning, Margaret. Good morning, Cornelius, she said, sounding surprised. Recovering quickly, she added, I need to see you urgently. Oh, what's the problem? Asked Cornelius, well aware exactly what the problem was. I can't possibly discuss such a delicate matter over the phone, but I could be with you by 10. I'm afraid I've already agreed to see Elizabeth at 10. It seems that she also has an urgent matter she needs to discuss with me. Why don't you come around at 11? Perhaps it would be better if I came over immediately, said Margaret, sounding flustered. Perhaps it would be better if I came over immediately, said Margaret, sounding flustered. No, I'm afraid 11 is the earliest I can fit you in, my dear. So it's 11 or afternoon tea. Which would you suit? Which would suit you best? 11. Hey, 11, said Margaret without hesitation. I thought it might be, said Cornelius. I'll look forward to seeing you then, he added before replacing the receiver. When Cornelius had finished dressing up, he went down to the kitchen for breakfast. A bowl of cornflakes, a copy of the local paper, and an unstamped envelope were waiting him, although there was no sign of Pauline. He poured himself a cup of tea, tore upon the envelope, and extracted the check made out to him for £500. He sighed. Pauline must have sold her car. He began to turn the pages of the Saturday supplement, stopping when he reached House for Sale. When the phone rang for the third time that morning, he had no idea who it might be. Good morning, Mr. Barrington, said a cheerful voice. It's Bruce from the estate agents. I thought I'd give you a call to let you know we've had an offer for the willows that is an excess of the asking price. Well done, said Cornelius. Thank you, sir. said the agent, with more respect in his voice than Cornelius had heard from anyone for weeks. But I think we should hold on for a longer. But I think we should hold on for a little longer. I'm confident I can squeeze some more out of them. If I do, my advice would be to accept the offer and ask for a 10% deposit. That sounds like a good advice to me, said Cornelius. And once they've signed the contract, I'll need you to find me a new house. What sort of things are you looking for, Mr. Barrington? I want something about half the size of the Willows, perhaps a couple of acres, and I'd like to remain in the immediate area. That shouldn't be too hard, sir. We have one or two excellent houses on our books at the moment, so I'm sure we'll be able to accommodate. So I'm sure we'll be able to accommodate you. Accommodate you. So we are sure we'll be. So I'm sure we'll be able to accommodate you. Thank you, said Cornelius, delighted to have spoken to someone who had begun the day well. He was chuckling over an item on the front page of the local paper when the doorbell rang. He checked his watch. It was still a few minutes to 10, so it couldn't be Elizabeth. When he opened the door, he was greeted by a man in green uniform, holding a clipboard in one hand and a parcel on the other. Sign here, was all the courier said, handing over a biro. Cornelius scrawled his signature across the bottom of the form. He would have asked who had sent the parcel if he had not been distracted by a car coming up the drive. Thank you, he said. He left the package in the hall and walked down the steps to welcome Elizabeth. When the car drew up outside the front door, Cornelius was surprised to find Hughes seated in the passenger seat. It was kind of you to see us at such short notice. It was kind of you to see us at such short notice, said Elizabeth, who looked as if she had spent another sleepless night. Good morning, Hughes, said Cornelius, who suspected his brother had been kept awake all night. Please come through to the kitchen. I'm afraid it's the only room in the house that's warm. As he led them down the long corridor, Elizabeth stopped in front of the portrait of Daniel. I'm so glad to see it back in its rightful place, she said. Hughes nodded in agreement. Cornelius stared at the portrait, which he hadn't seen since the auction. Yes, back in its rightful place, he said, before taking them through to the kitchen. Now, what brings you both to the Willows on a Saturday morning? He asked as he filled the kettle. It's about the Louis XIV table, said Elizabeth, definitely. Diffidently. Yes, I shall miss it, said Cornelius. But it was a fine gesture on your part, Hughes, he added. A fine gesture? Repeated Hughes. Yes, I assumed it was your way of returning my 100,000, said Cornelius. Turning to Elizabeth, he said, How I misjudged you, Elizabeth. I suspect it was your idea all along. Elizabeth and Hughes just stared at each other, then both began speaking at once. Both began speaking at once. But we didn't, said Hughes. We were rather hoping, said Elizabeth. Then they both fell silent. Tell me the truth. We were rather hoping, said Elizabeth. Then they both fell silent. Tell him the truth, said Hughes firmly. Oh, said Cornelius. Have I misunderstood what took place at the auction yesterday? Yes, I am. Yes, I'm afraid you have, said Elizabeth. Any remaining color draining from her cheeks. Any remaining color draining from her cheeks. You see, the truth of the matter is that the whole thing got out of control, and I carried on bidding for longer than I should have done. She paused. I'd never been to an auction before, and when I failed to get the grandfather clock, and then saw Margaret pick up the tuner so cheaply, I'm afraid I made a bit of a fool of myself. When you can always put it back up for sale, said Cornelius with a mock sadness. It's a fine piece and sure to retain its value. We've already looked into that, said Elizabeth, but Mr. Bott says there won't but Mr. Botts says there won't be an but Mr. Botts says there won't be another auction for at least 3 months, and the terms of the sale were clearly printed in the catalogue. Settlement within 7 days. But I'm sure that if you were to leave the piece with him, yes, he suggested that, said Hughes. But we didn't realize that the auctioneers added 15% to the sale price, so the real bill is for £126,500. And that's worse. If we put it up for sale again, they also retain 50% of the price that's bid. So we would end up losing over 13,000. Yes, that's the way auctioneers make their money, said Cornelius with a sigh. But we don't have 30,000, let alone 126 or 126,500, cried Elizabeth. Cornelius slowly poured himself another cup of tea, pretending to be deep in thought. He finally offered. He finally offered. What puzzles me is how you think I could help bearing in mind my current financial predicament. We thought as the auction had raised nearly £1 million, began Elizabeth, far higher than was estimated, chipped in you. He hoped you might tell Mr. Botts you'd decided to keep the peace. We hoped you might tell Mr. Botts you'd decided to keep the peace. And of course, we would confirm that that was acceptable to us. I'm sure you would, said Cornelius, but that still doesn't solve the problem of owing the auctioneer 16,500 and as a possible further loss if it fails to reach 110,000 in 3 months' time. Neither Elizabeth nor Hughes spoke. Do you have anything you could sell to help raise the money? Cornelius eventually asked. Only our house, and that already has a large mortgage on it, said Elizabeth. But what about your shares in the company? If you sold them, I'm sure they would more than cover the cost. But who would want to buy them? Asked Hughes, when we're only just breaking even. I would, said Cornelius. Both of them looked surprised. And in exchange for your shares, said Cornelius continued, I would release you from your debt to me and also settle any embarrassment with Mr. Botts. Elizabeth began to protest. But Hughes asked, is there any alternative? Not that I can think of, said Cornelius. Then I don't see that then I don't see that we're left with much choice, said Hughes, turning to his wife. But what about all those years we've put into the company? Wailed Elizabeth. The shop wasn't the shop hasn't been showing a worthwhile profit for some time, Elizabeth, and you know it. If we don't accept The shop hasn't been showing a worthwhile profit for some time, Elizabeth, and you know it. If we don't accept Cornelius' offer, we could be paying off the debt for the rest of our lives. Elizabeth remained unusually silent. Well, that seemed to be settled, said Cornelius. Why don't you just pop around and have a word with my solicitor? He'll see that everything is in order. And will you sort out Mr. Botts? Asked Elizabeth. The moment you've signed over the shares, I'll deal with the problem of Botts. I'm confident we can have everything settled by the end of the week. Hughes bowed his head. And I think it might be wise, continued Cornelius. They both looked up and stared apprehensively at him. If Hughes were to remain on the board of the company as chairman with the appropriate remuneration. Thank you, thank you, said Hughes, shaking his hands with his brother. That's generous of you in circumstances. That's generous of you in the circumstance. As they returned down the corridor, Cornelius stared at the portrait of his son once again. Have you managed to somewhere to live? Have you managed to find somewhere to live? Asked Elizabeth. It looks as if that won't be a problem after all. Thank you, Elizabeth. I've had an offer for the villas far in excess of the price I'd anticipated, and what with the windfall from the auction, I'll be able to pay off all my creditors, leaving me with a comfortable sum money. With a comfortable sum over. Then why do you need it? Then why do you need our shares? Asked Elizabeth, swinging back to face him. For the same reason you wanted my Louis XIV table, my dear, said Cornelius, as he opened the front door to show them out. Goodbye, you, he added as Elizabeth got into the car. Cornelius would have returned to the house, but he spotted Margaret coming up the drive in her car. Cornelius would have returned to the house, but he spotted Margaret coming up the drive in a new car. So he stood and waited for her. When she brought the little Audi to a halt, Cornelius opened the car door to allow her to step out. Good morning, Margaret, he said, as he accompanied her up the stairs and into the house. How nice to see you back at the Willows. I can't remember when you were last here. I've made a dreadful mistake, his sister admitted, long before they had reached the kitchen. Cornelius refilled the kettle and waited for her to tell him something he already knew. I won't beat about the bush, Cornelius. You see, I had no out. You see, I had no idea there were two Turners. Oh, yes, said Cornelius, matter of factly. Joseph Mallord William Turner, arguably the finest painter ever to hail from these shores, and William Turner of Oxford. No relation, and although painting at roughly the same period, certainly not in the same league as the master. But I didn't realize that, Margaret repeated. So I ended up paying far too much for the wrong Turner. Not helped by my sister-in-law's antics, she added. Page number 92, we continued. Good morning, Margaret, he said, as he accompanied her by the steps and into the house. How nice to see you back at the Willows. I can't remember when you were last here. I made a dreadful mistake, his sister admitted, long before they had reached the kitchen. Cornelius refilled the kettle and waited for her to tell him something he already knew. I won't beat about the bush, Cornelius. You see, I had no idea there were two Turners. Oh, yes, said Cornelius, matter of factly. Joseph Mallord William Turner, arguably the finest painter ever to hail from these shores, and William Turner of Oxford. No relation. And although painting at roughly the same period, certainly not in the same league as the master. But I didn't realize that, Margaret repeated. So I ended up paying for too much for the wrong Turner, not helped by my sister-in-law antics, she added. Yes, I was fascinated to read in the morning paper that you got yourself into the Guinness Book of Records for having paid a record price for the artist. A record I could have done without, said Margaret. I was rather hoping you might feel able to have a word with Mr. Botts and what? Asked Cornelius innocently as he poured his sister a cup of tea. Explain to him that it was all a terrible mistake. I'm afraid that won't be possible, my dear. You see, once the hammer has come down, the sale is completed. That's the law of the land. Perhaps you could help me out by paying for the picture, Margaret suggested. After all the papers are you seeing, you made nearly £1 million from the auction alone. But I have so many other commitments to consider, said Cornelius with a sigh. Don't forget that once the Willows is sold, I will have to find somewhere else to live. But you could always come and stay with me. That's the second such offer I've had this morning, said Cornelius. And as I explained to Elizabeth, after being turned down by both of you earlier, I've had to make alternative arrangements. Then I'm ruined, said Margaret dramatically, because I don't have £1,000. Not to mention the 15%, something else I didn't know about. You see, I hope to make a small profit by putting the painting back up for sale at Christie's. The truth at last, thought Cornelius, or perhaps half the truth. Cornelius, you've always been the clever one in the family, Margaret said, with tears welling up in her eyes. Surely you can think of a way out of this dilemma. Cornelius paced around the kitchen as if in deep thought, his sister watching his every step. Eventually he came to a halt in front of her. I do believe I may have a solution. What is it? Cried Margaret. I'll agree to anything. Anything? Anything, she repeated. Good. Then I'll tell you what I'll do, said Cornelius. I'll pay for the picture in exchange for your new car. Margaret remained speechless for some time. But the car cost me £12,000, she said finally. Possibly, but you wouldn't get more than 8,000 for it second hand. But then how would I get around? Try the bus, said Cornelius. I can recommend it. Once you have mastered the timetable, it changes your whole life. He glanced at his watch. In fact, you could start right now. There's one due in about 10 minutes. But, said Margaret, as Cornelius stretched out his open hand. Then, letting out a long sigh, she opened her handbag and passed the car keys over to her brother. Thank you, said Cornelius. Now I mustn't hold you up any longer, or you'll miss the bus. And there won't be another one along for 30 minutes. He led his sister out of the kitchen and down the corridor. He smiled as he opened the door for her. And don't forget to pick up the picture from Mr. Botts, my dear, he said. It will look wonderful over the fireplace in our drawing room and will bring back so many happy memories of our time together. Margaret didn't comment as she turned to walk off down the long drive. Cornelius closed the door and was about to go to his study and call Frank to brief him on what had taken place that morning when he thought he heard a noise coming from the kitchen. He changed direction and headed back down the corridor. He walked into the kitchen, went over to the sink, bent down, and kissed Pauline on the cheek. Good morning, Pauline, he said. What's that for? She asked, her hand immersed in soapy water. For bringing my son back home. It's only a loan. If you don't behave yourself, it goes straight back to my place. Cornelius smiled. That reminds me, I'd like to take you up on your original offer. What are you talking about, Mr. Barrington? You told me that you'd rather work off the debt than have to sell your car. He removed her check from an inside pocket. I know just how many hours you've worked here over the past month, he said, tearing the check in half. So let's call it quits. That's very kind of you, Mr. Barrington, but I only wish you told me that before I sold the car. That's not a problem, Pauline, because I find myself the proud owner of a new car. But how? Asked Pauline as she began to dry her hands. It was an unexpected gift from my sister, Cornelia said, without further explanation. But you don't drive, Mr. Barrington. I know, so I'll tell you what I'll do, said Cornelius. I'll swap it for the picture of Daniel. But that's not a fair exchange, Mr. Barrington. I only paid £50 for the picture, and the car must be worth far more. Then you'll also have to agree to drive me into town from time to time. Does that mean I've got my old job back? Yes, if you're willing to give up your new one. I don't have a new one, said Pauline with a sigh. They found someone a lot younger than me the day before I was due to begin. Cornelius threw his arms around her. And we'll have less of that for a start, Mr. Barrington. Cornelius took a pace back. Of course, you can have your old job back and with a raise in salary. Whatever you consider is appropriate, Mr. Barrington. After all, the laborer is worthy of his hire. Cornelius somehow stopped himself from laughing. Does this mean all the furniture will be coming back to the Willows? No, Pauline. This house has been far too large for me since Millie's death. I should have realized that some time long ago. I'm going to move out and look for something smaller. I could have told you to do that years ago, Pauline said. She hesitated. But will that nice Mr. Vincent still be coming to supper on Thursday evenings? Until one of us dies, that's for sure, said Cornelius with a chuckle. Well, I can't stand around all day chattering, Mr. Barrington. After all, a woman's work is never done. Quite so, said Cornelius, and quickly left the kitchen. He walked back through the hall, picked up the package, and took it through to his study. He had removed only the outer layer of the wrapping paper when the phone rang. He put the package to one side and picked up the receiver to hear Timothy's voice. It was good of you to come to the auction, Timothy. I appreciated that. I'm only sorry that my funds didn't stretch to buying you the chess set, Uncle Cornelius. If only your mother and aunt had shown the same restraint. I'm not sure I understand, Uncle. It's not important, said Cornelius. So, what can I do for you, young man? You've obviously forgotten that I said I'd come over and read the rest of that story to you. Unless, of course, you've already finished. No, I'd quite forgotten about it. What with the drama of the last few days? Why don't you come around tomorrow evening? Then we can have supper as well. And before you groan, the good news is that Pauline is back. That's excellent news, Uncle Cornelius. I'll see you around 8 tomorrow. I look forward to it, said Cornelius. He replaced the receiver and returned to the half-opened package. Even before he had removed the final layer of paper, he knew exactly what was inside. His heart began beating faster. He finally raised the lid of the heavy wooden box and stared down at 32 exquisite ivory pieces. There was a note inside. A small appreciation for all your kindness over the years. Huge. Then he recalled the face of the woman who had slipped past him at the auction house. Of course, it had been his brother's secretary. The second time he had misjudged someone. What an irony, he said out loud. If Hughes had put the set up for sale at Sotheby's, he could have held on to the Louis XIV table and had the same amount left over. Still, as Pauline would have said, it's the thought that counts. He was writing a thank you note to his brother when the phone rang again. It was Frank, reliable as ever, reporting in on his meeting with Hughes. Your brother has signed all the necessary documents, and the shares have been transferred as requested. That was quick work, said Cornelius. The moment you gave me instructions last week, I had all the legal papers drawn up. You're still the most impatient client I have. Shall I bring the share certificate around on Thursday evening? No, said Cornelius. I'll drop in this afternoon and pick them up. That is, assuming Pauline is free to drive me into town. Am I missing something? Asked Frank, sounding a little bewildered. And don't worry, Frank, I'll bring you up to date when I see you on Thursday evening. Timothy arrived at the Willows a few minutes after 8 the following evening. Pauline immediately put him to work peeling potatoes. How are your mother and father? Asked Cornelius, probing to discover how much the boy knew. They seem fine, thank you, uncle. By the way, my father's offered me the job of shop manager. I begin on the first of the next month. Congratulations, said Cornelius. I'm delighted. When did he make the offer? Sometime last week, replied Timothy. Oh, which day? Is it important? Asked Timothy. I think it might be, replied Cornelius, without explanation. The young man remained silent for some time before he finally said, Yes, it was Saturday evening. After I'd seen you. He paused. I'm not sure Mum's all that happy about it. I meant to write and let you know, but as I was coming back for the auction, I thought I'd tell you in person. But then I didn't get a chance to speak to you. So he offered you the job before the auction took place. Oh, yes, said Timothy. Nearly a week before. Once again, the young man looked quizzically at his uncle, but still no explanation was forthcoming. Pauline placed a plate of roast beef in front of each of them as Timothy began to reveal his plan for the company's future. Mind you, although Dad will remain as chairman, he said, he's promised not to interfere too much. I was wondering, Uncle Cornelius, now that you own 1% of the company, whether you would be willing to join the board. Cornelius looked first surprised, then delighted, then doubtful. I could do with your experience, added Timothy, if I am to go ahead with my expansion plans. I'm not sure your father would consider it a good idea to have me on the board, said Cornelius, with a weary smile. I can't think why not, said Timothy. After all, it was his idea in the first place. Cornelius remained silent for some time. He hadn't expected to go on learning more about the players after the game was officially over. I think the time has come for us to go upstairs and find out if it's Simon Clark or Raymond Gloud who becomes Prime Minister, he eventually said. Timothy waited until his uncle had poured himself a large brandy and lit a cigar, his first for a month, before he started to read. He became so engrossed in the story that he didn't look up again until he had turned the last page, where he found an envelope taped to the inside of the book's cover. It was addressed to Mr. Timothy Barrington. What's this? He asked. Cornelius would have told him, but he had fallen asleep. The doorbell rang at 8, as it did every Thursday evening when Pauline opened the door. Frank handed her a large bunch of flowers. Oh, Mr. Barrington will appreciate those, she said. I'll put them in the library. They're not for Mr. Barrington, said Frank with a wink. I'm sure I don't know what's come over you two gentlemen, Pauline said, scurrying away to the kitchen. As Frank dug into a second bowl of Irish stew, Cornelius warned him that it could be their last meal together at the Willows. Does that mean you've sold the house? Frank asked, looking up. Yes, we exchanged contract this afternoon, but on the condition that I move out immediately. After such a generous offer, I am in no position to argue. And how's the search for a new place coming along? I think I've found the ideal house, and once the surveyors have given the all clear, I'll be putting an offer in. I'll need you to push the paperwork through as quickly as possible so that I'm not homeless for too long. I certainly will, said Frank. But in the meantime, you'd better come and camp out with me. I'm all too aware what the alternatives are. With a grin, the local pub, Elizabeth or Margaret, said Cornelius with a grin. He raised his glass. Thank you for the offer. I accept it. But there's one condition, said Frank. And what might that be? Asked Cornelius. That Pauline comes as part of the package, because I have no intention of spending all my spare time tidying up after you. What do you think about that, Pauline? Asked Cornelius as she began to clear away the plates. I am willing to keep house for both of you gentlemen, but only for 1 month. Otherwise, you'd never move out, Mr. Barrington. I'll make sure there are no hold-ups with the legal work. I promise, said Frank. Cornelius leaned across to him conspiratorially. She hates lawyers, but I do think she's got a soft spot for you. That may well be the case, Mr. Barrington, but it won't stop me for leaving after a month if you haven't moved into your new house. I think you'd better put down the deposit fairly quickly, said Frank. Good houses come on the market all the time. Good housekeepers rarely. Isn't it time you two gentlemen got on with your game? Agreed, said Cornelius. But first, a toast. Who to? Asked Frank. Young Timothy, said Cornelius, raising his glass, who will start as managing director of Barrington's surely on the first of the month. To Timothy, said Frank, raising the glass. He's asked me to join the board, said Cornelius. You'll enjoy that, and he'll benefit from your experience. But it still doesn't explain why you gave him all your shares in the company, despite him failing to secure the chess set for you. That's precisely why I am willing to let him take control of the company. Timothy, unlike his mother and father, didn't allow his heart to rule his head. Frank nodded his approval. As Cornelius drained the last drop of wine from one glass they'd allowed themselves before a game. Now I feel I ought to warn you, said Cornelius, as he rose from his place, that the only reason you have won the last 3 encounters in a row is simply because I have had other things on my mind. Now that those matters have been resolved, your run of luck is about to come to an end. We shall see, said Frank, as they marched down the long corridor together. The two men stopped for a moment to admire the portrait of Daniel. How did you get that back? Asked Frank. I had to strike a mean bargain with Pauline, but we both ended up with what we wanted. But how? Began Frank. It's a long story, Cornelius replied, and I'll tell you the details over a brandy after I've won the game. Cornelius opened the library door and allowed his friend to enter ahead of him, so that he could observe his reaction. When the inscrutable lawyer saw the chess set laid out before him, he made no comment, but simply walked across to the far side of the table, took his usual place, and said, Your move first, if I remember correctly. You're right, said Cornelius, trying to hide his irritation. He pushed his queen's pawn to Q4. Back to an orthodox opening gambit. I see I shall have to concentrate tonight. They had been playing for about an hour, no word having passed between them, when Cornelius could bear it no longer. Are you not in the least bit curious to discover how I came back into possession of this chess set? He asked. No, said Frank, his eyes remaining fixed on the board. Not in the least bit. But why not, you old dullard? Because I already know, Frank said, as he moved his queen's bishop across the board. How can you possibly know? Demanded Cornelius, who responded by moving a knight back to defend his king. Frank smiled. You forgot that you was also my client, he said, moving his king's rook to square to the right. Cornelius smiled. And to think he need never have sacrificed his share if he had only known the true value of chess sets. He returned his queen to its home square. But he did know its true value, said Frank, as he considered his opponent's last move. How could he possibly have found out when you and I were the only people who knew? Because I told him, said Frank, matter of factly. But why would you do that? Asked Cornelius, staring across at his old friend. Because it was the only way I could find out if Hughes and Elizabeth were working together. So why didn't he bid for the set in the morning auction? Precisely because he didn't want Elizabeth to know what he was up to. Once he discovered that Timothy was also hoping to purchase the set in order to give it back to you, he remained silent. But he could have kept bidding once Timothy had fallen out. No, he couldn't. He had agreed to bid for the Louis XIV table, if you recall. And that was the last item to come under the hammer. But Elizabeth failed to get the long case clock, so she could have bid for it. Elizabeth is not my client, said Frank, as he moved his queen across the board. So she never discovered the chess set's true value. She believed what you had told her, that at best it was worth a few £100, which is why you introduced his secretary to bid for the set in the afternoon. Sometimes you can miss the most obvious things, even when they are staring you right in the face, said Cornelius, pushing his rook 5 squares forward. I concur with their judgment, said Frank, moving his queen across to take Cornelius' rook. He looked up at his opponent and said, I think you'll find that's checkmate.